Hello, welcome to my review of Snow Crash, a 1992 novel from Hugo Award winner Neal Stephenson. Snow Crash follows occasional pizza delivery driver, sometime hacker, always amusingly named Hiro Protagonist, through an out-of-date future world that is threatened when a mysterious new drug hits the virtual streets. The plot summary is about to begin, so remember that although you can skip this section if you wish, none of this review should be considered spoiler-free. The novel starts with Hiro attempting to earn a crust delivering a pizza for the mafia. The delivery goes awry but introduces him to YT, a skateboard courier who successfully completes the delivery and earns the gratitude of the mafia in the process. Hiro, though, loses his job, but he logs into the metaverse, a virtual world he helped to code, where he's offered a mysterious drug, supposedly impossible in that virtual world, which he declines. He meets virtual club owner, friend and ex-boss David and his ex-girlfriend Juanita. David takes the drug and is crashed out of the virtual world. In the real world, Hiro is also a concert promoter, but somehow this results in him chasing around after a nuclear-armed hitman called Raven who kills some drug dealers at the concert. Juanita has given Hiro a virtual library and he spends the next 400 pages talking to her about ancient gods and a disappearance of language at Babel. Meanwhile, YT, notably not called Protagonist, is the only one really doing anything. The mafia have her running around town and the last remnants of the American government attempt to capture her. She ends up kidnapped by a cult who take her onto an old aircraft carrier out to sea, which is now planning to spread the drug, which is actually a religion and a virus, around the world. Hiro, initially aided by the mafia, attempts to rescue her and then does this on his own. Raven, absent for the intervening 80% of the book, returns for some explicit sex with the underage YT, which absolutely comes out of nowhere. He then takes the drug, and because the real world plot has failed, he intends to infect the virtual world with it. Hiro chases him on a motorbike, they have a sword fight which Hiro wins, saving the world. Snow Crash is not a book of the proverbial two halves. It's nearer 1/4 versus 3. The opening scene is incredible, with Hiro burning through a gloriously rendered cyberpunk landscape in his armour-plated pizza delivery car. He races through an America fenced off into burbclaves, aglow with personalised neon adverts. Where every corner has the same franchised streets, it's a place that emphasises the impersonal, the racist and the convenient. Every little detail is rendered in high-def prose that makes it both exhilarating and beautiful. Into Hiro's moment of crisis skates YT, short for yours truly, a precocious, cool to the core 15-year-old girl. Working as a courier, she harpoons vehicles, surfing the traffic to get from drop-off to drop-off. She helps Hiro on a whim and makes a friend in the mafia. For his part, in an almost failed delivery, Hiro makes a debt with them, but the two inevitably become friends. The first 33 pages of Snow Crash are explosive, are glorious, and well into the masterpiece territory. It makes you wish that the pizza delivery could have been exploited more, perhaps even the A plot that resolves the B, or the journey could be the focus of the book, similar to Zelazny's Damnation Alley or Walter John Williams' Hardwired, both of which are reviewed on this very channel. After all, the stakes of working for the mafia are sky high, literally life or death. The trouble with Snow Crash is that, rather like Hiro's pizza delivery, it goes wrong fast and hard, because the details of the text are glorious at first. The mafia's advertising slogan, "The Mafia, you've got a friend in the family," is so perfectly judged, and the franchise security industry has turned the Miranda rights into a stream of legal babble, of which this is just a part. You are hereby warned that any movement on your part, not explicitly endorsed by authorization on my part, may pose a direct physical risk to you, as well as consequential, psychological, and possibly, depending on your personal belief system, spiritual risks ensuing from your personal reaction to said physical risk. Any movement on your part constitute an implicit and irrevocable acceptance of said risk. But what that really doesn't need is to then be explained like this, or as we used to say, "Freeze, sucker." And these little interjections break up the stream of legalese, explaining the joke to a mythical audience that Stevenson doesn't already have eating out of the palm of his hand. It's the first sign that he isn't quite the writer that the opening suggested, almost like he doesn't know how good he is. or more likely from what follows, that he just wasn't as good as it seemed. Because while the legalese almost works, the government's 5-page memo on toilet paper usage is ridiculously self-indulgent. The jokes by this point are not landing, and in truth, the second one is simply a reworking of the first, the translation of the mundane into the bloated and ridiculous. The sardonic and all-knowing narrator starts to come out with drivel like this. It was, of course, nothing more than sexism, the especially virulent type espoused by male techies who sincerely believe they're too smart to be sexist. Way to slander an entire industry. Or this clumsy and lazy breaking of the literary fourth wall. And after that, it's just a chase scene. And it's why we need to take a deep dive into the culture and methods of the pirates, 330 pages into a 440-page novel, when we're still waiting for the denouement to at least appear on the horizon. But that's also a symptom of a writer who desperately needs to recapture the exuberance and power of his opening, or at least just get the on with it. About halfway through, as a reader, we have the lay of the land, both real and virtual, but we're still waiting for the story to begin. Instead, Juanita, in a rare appearance, gives Hiro a virtual library that comes with a virtual librarian, and thereafter, for some 300 pages, this book reads like a GCSE textbook on Babylonia. The scary thing is, for me as an occasional part qualified linguist, is how desperately dull Stephenson makes it all. Really desperately dull. This book became a slog. I even confessed to starting to speed read it when, after explaining all this over hundreds of pages, Hiro needs to do a 12-page recap towards the end. It's one of my interests, and it still bored me to tears. It also contains some genuine inaccuracies. Hiro, admittedly not a linguist, says everyone gets conquered sooner or later, but the languages don't die out. Wrong. Languages die out all the time, and conquering isn't even necessarily part of it. We see this in modern times in the UK in the 1980s. It was lobbying and political pressure tied to a nationalist identity that stopped Welsh from dying out. When nations have borders, the desire to trade means that along the border the languages start to blur. They combine into a Creole, but if there is any kind of economical power imbalance, then the original language comes under threat. Language death is as natural to a language life cycle as language evolution. In more modern times, the link between language and culture, and particularly national identity, makes losing a language a hot button topic, but it didn't always used to be that way, and in certain parts of the world it still isn't. What Hiro says is drivel, but Stephenson isn't teaching linguistics, he's talking bollocks, trying to link the Tower of Babel to the Word of God to computer code. He says this: and computer code is a form of speech. No, computer code is a form of writing, and you only need to talk to somebody who is illiterate to know how very different speech and writing are. Despite that, the premise of Stevenson's treatise might well be interesting if it wasn't related as a question and answer session between Hiro and the librarian, or if the 100+ pages was as long as Hiro's later summary. Because that bloated session means that the villain of the piece is scarcely mentioned between two scenes, one on 152 pages and his next appearance on 319. Between the two, he's hardly mentioned, and when he appears and drags Whitey out on a date, the age gap is considerable and her age is a particular problem, but their interactions just genuinely leave you wondering where it all came from. They barely know each other. She's a child, so hormonal, but where does his infatuation come from? It really is just so out of the blue as to be completely implausible, and the explicit nature of the sex scene as well is rather unnecessary. And not just because she's a child, but then you do wonder, why is she 15? That's the creator's prerogative. But what does it add? Well, she's lively and precocious and certainly wise beyond her years. For me, though, if I was writing about a relationship between two people with these ages, especially with her being under the age of consent, it would be to show that society has devolved or collapsed and no longer capable of the most basic tenet of civilization, protecting the young and most vulnerable. That's not the only story you can tell, and it would be unnecessary in this futuristic but ravaged America. We already see that it's a disaster. In fact, if she'd had a relationship with Enzo, the head of the mafia, it would actually have made more sense, because they at least have some sort of chemistry, enough of a relationship between them to make it plausible. The fact that the relationship between Whitey and Raven adds nothing and comes out of nowhere at all, makes it all the seedier, and Whitey is a fun character, so she deserves better. Why not Hiro? They are our two leads after all, and of a slightly more comparable age. But Hiro can't be in love with Whitey because he's in love with Juanita, the most unused character in any novel I've read this year. She's hardly worthy of a footnote, she's mentioned so little, and the idea that I'd care about the two of them getting back together is actually laughable. She's just barely in this book. Here's an idea. Juanita is the expert who knows about Babel, so get rid of the librarian and have her teach Hiro. Then she's in the book, and then they at least have some degree of relationship to relate to. Stephenson actually can write. His narration is sarcastic and brutal, occasionally lazy as mentioned, but generally an engaging force in the text. His action at the start particularly is great. The world building is really strong and would be stronger too if he just knew when to stop. The third act is not the place for it, and the pirates are so pointless. But I really like the simile here, which is a good example of many, of Stevenson just having that sort of flair that really draws you in. After Dad left, she just folded up into herself like an origami bird thrown into the fire. I might have gone with origami flower, which would have worked well in the context, but the bird, of course, makes it a reference to Blade Runner, which is another cyberpunk great and reviewed on this very channel. In conclusion, there is a lot of good in Snow Crash. None of it is the story, though. Cutting 100 pages of talking to the librarian would have raised the good-bad ratio to a much more favourable number. The good includes a wonderful opening, two engaging and likeable characters, and not one, but two striking and spectacularly crafted worlds. Add to that a narrator that is mostly well judged and sparkles with a dry wit and a really nice turn of phrase here and there. Unfortunately, Snow Crash is also bloated to the point of tedium for long stretches and desperately needed some brutal cutting. Ultimately, the magnificent opening begins to feel like an aside that really bears little connection to the rest of the story, and as much fun as there is in exploring this world, Snow Crash would make a better RPG than it does a novel. The non-fiction of David Crystal or Andy Kirkpatrick make linguistics seem more interesting. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more of this sort of thing.